So back in 2015, I think when Deepika actually spoke about her experience on national primetime television, that was probably the first time, that mental health was being addressed on public television at such a, prominent sort of feature. And that really opened the floodgates for people to accept that, there is something called mental health and mental illness, that so many people are being affected by it. And it was almost a moment where, those who were suffering felt a little bit of relief that someone has actually spoken about this. So I think that was probably, in the timeline of events, the first thing that set the ball rolling.
Hello and a warm welcome to a very special podcast, Unusual Suspects. I'm your host, Gaurav Chaudhary. This is a series about unraveling stories of entrepreneurs, investors, professionals, and of course philanthropists who are disruptors, yet not in your face. Their disruptions have consistently delivered on the purpose and the mission they've embarked on. Their values are as strong as the mission. While they're ruthless in pursuing their ambition, they don't stray from being leaders who are not just admired for the vision and relentless pursuit, but also for how they're building an ecosystem of believers who consistently push the boundaries. In each episode, I speak to one such leader, talking to her or him or them about their businesses, lives, inspirations, interests, challenges, pivot moments and turning points, successes, failures, agonies and ecstasies, and of course, the little joys of life. It is as much about the personal life stories as about their entrepreneurial, professional, and philanthropic journeys too. Unusual Suspects streams on Earshot.in, Spotify.com, Apple Podcasts, Moneycontrol.com, and a host of other podcast streaming platforms and directories. For this episode, I'm delighted to have Anisha Padukone, the CEO of LiveLoveLaugh, a charitable trust founded by Deepika Padukone in 2016. The organization works to bring hope to those facing stress, anxiety, and depression. As the CEO, Anisha leads the organization's programs, fundraising, and policy outreach, helping the foundation drive change in India's mental health space, particularly for the marginalized communities. She holds a degree in psychology, sociology, and economics, and has also completed programs in strategic nonprofit management at the Harvard Business School and Ashoka University. Anisha was also part of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council for Mental Health. Welcome to Unusual Suspects, Anisha. Delighted to have you on the show.
Hi, Gaurav. Thank you so much. Very, very glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Anisha, let's start off with a fundamental question for my own understanding and the understanding of the listeners. It's a kind of a paradox too. During the course of this podcast, I'm sure you'll be able to clarify many of those. Just to put things in context, over the past decade, there has been a significant increase in awareness about mental health, and there is no denying that fact. Yet at the same time, it still remains a little bit stigmatized, and accessibility remains, particularly among certain communities and classes of people, remain major barriers. What do you think has driven this awareness? Of course, there has been the media explosion over the last 10 years. Everything has got digitized, and we have content consumption has moved entirely to our palm tops. At the same time, why hasn't it translated into more widespread action, or why hasn't it triggered systemic change of a very different kind? I'll give you one context because data always helps. If you look at a recently presented Union Budget 2025, the government has allocated, the finance minister has allocated nearly 1 lakh crore for the healthcare sector, which essentially means that amount of money will be spent for developing, maintaining, and improving the healthcare system across the country, which is just about a 10% increase over the previous year. At the same time, of this 1 lakh crore, if you pick mental health, for instance, one program of mental health, the National Tele Mental Health Program has been given about 80 crore. Now, what's your view on this, and what does it say about the current prioritization? Do you think we are getting the priorities a little suboptimal here, so far as mental health is concerned? Anisha?
So, Gaurav, I think great question to start off with. And I'm going to answer that in two parts. So I think the first part is a little bit, from the perspective of, let's say, glass half full, right? If we look at the landscape of mental health over the last decade, maybe 15 years, We're talking about, 15 years back, almost nobody was talking about mental health. Nobody knew what mental health was. Nobody was accepting this as a topic. And it was, largely people suffering, and then they had to also sort of sweep it under the carpet and not have to talk about or seek help for this. Now, in 2025 today, and if you look at the last 10 to 15 years, there have, in fact, been, fairly significant steps that have been taken at a policy level and otherwise in terms of the work being done by individuals, by organizations, by foundations like ours. There is a lot going on. How much of this is actually in the public domain and people are aware of, I'm not so sure. So I want to just, shed some light on those aspects. I think the first, thing that comes to my mind when you talk about awareness. So back in 2015, I think when Deepika actually spoke about her experience on national primetime television, that was probably the first time, that mental health was being addressed on public television at such a, prominent sort of feature. And that really opened the floodgates for people to accept that, there is something called mental health and mental illness, that so many people are being affected by it. And it was almost a moment where, those who were suffering felt a little bit of relief that someone has actually spoken about this. So I think that was probably, in the timeline of events, the first thing that set the ball rolling. The second thing, in my opinion, is actually the Mental Health Care Act of 2017. And there were a lot of, people responsible for this, and credit to them, including, administrators. Again, another sort of watershed moment. And, just to highlight one or two things, for example, suicide was decriminalized in this act, before which it was actually a criminal offense. Secondly, insurance coverage being treated on par with physical illnesses. So this was sort of the second thing that took place. And thereafter, there have been, a lot of foundations that have been set up and doing some really good work at the grassroots level, at a urban city level, at an awareness level, and working as well in a lot of niches. Similarly, a lot of individuals and celebrities and otherwise have spoken about mental health very openly since then to tackle the stigma and awareness. And from the government side, I think one of the most recent interventions, like you just mentioned, is the Telemanas program, right? Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman during COVID announced a very, very sort of a hefty budget to be able to invest in mental health. And currently, there are about, almost every state in the country has a Telemanas cell where people can call in and take free counseling support. Now, this is not only, operational 24/7, it's also available in various languages of the state. So to come back to my previous point, I think these are some of the things that are sort of, glass half full, and there has been a lot going on. And we've seen, of course, that change. But on the flip side, the reason why maybe you feel and is also true that there hasn't been enough done is largely because of the scale of this problem. And if you look at 2017 statistic from the Lancet Journal, back then almost 200 million Indians will be affected by mental illness in their lifetime. And mind you, this is a pre-COVID statistic. We don't have updated stats. So while we're doing, a certain amount of things at various levels in mental health and trying to tackle mental illness, unfortunately, the size and scale of this problem requires everything to be done, I would think now, much more rapidly and a much faster pace and with more sort of depth of quality. And that is really where, we have to kind of look at maybe the next, decade or so for India when it comes to mental health.
Absolutely, Anisha. Very well said. And I'll come to a bit of some Lancet numbers subsequently. But, taking on from what you very nicely articulated, my question is a little more narrow focused. Despite the increased awareness, and that's a significant first step, actually. We are talking much more about mental health now than we were talking about it, say, about 10 years ago. Despite that, however, many people still struggle to access mental health care? And the reasons, it's a very nuanced thing, and it's not a binary. A binary analysis of this would probably not yield the responses that we're looking for. There are barriers, and there are cultural issues, there are systemic issues, there are economic issues, and probably that is the reason why we have so much of underreporting of mental health issues. What do you think, in your view, which are the biggest barriers do you think that we probably need to dismantle? Of course, it'll be a slow moving variable, but what are the barriers do you think that we need to dismantle for individuals and to enable them to seek or receive help as and when they need without too much of a hassle? Anisha?
So I think Gaurav, like you said, mental health is extremely nuanced, and we can spend probably a whole podcast just to answer this question. But I can just answer that in a three-step sort of a format. And this is something that our foundation, that's the Live Love Laugh Foundation, is focusing on. Not to say that these are the only three sort of things to work on in mental health, but at least from our perspective, we think these are the three most important for the time being, given where India is in its path or journey of mental health. I think the first thing is, without a doubt, awareness. And like I said previously, while we have made some progress when it comes to the understanding of mental health and destigmatization, we still have a very long way to go. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is actually, now that there is a little bit more awareness, you also have to enable access to information and credible resources and professionals. So access becomes the second sort of pivot. There's a lot of information on mental health out there, but how much of that is credible, how much of it can be trusted, that becomes very critical, so that there's no sort of misinformation going around. And secondly, even if I've become aware as an individual, or let's say that stigma has broken down and I'm willing to seek help, there's a lot of lack of clarity about certain things. For example, what is the difference between a counselor and a psychiatrist? Who should I go to first? Who is a reputed person versus not? With psychiatrists, probably it's a little bit easier to define because, they're medical doctors. But with counselors, for example, we don't have a recognized, credible body that identifies, maybe like the American Psychological Association in the US. We don't have something like that in India to differentiate. So that becomes, a second sort of challenge. And thirdly, irrespective of whether it's rural India or urban India, there is, mental health care is not affordable. A very, very small percentage of the population can actually afford mental health care. And therefore, I think these are the three areas that we really need to sort of work on. And that's also the work which we're doing. So just to summarize, the three A's, which is just slightly easier to remember, that is awareness, accessibility, and affordability of mental health care.
Absolutely, Anisha. It's a good point to actually segue on to the next question, which is about women, and women in particular face unique mental health challenges, and these are because of the social structures that we continue to have in India, and also because of the gender roles that have got defined in India over centuries. Now, just to put things in context, if you look at the mental health survey 2015-16 data, the prevalence of mental health disorders among women is significantly higher than among men. I would assume these are all reported cases, with conditions such as depression and anxiety being at least twice as common in women compared to men. Now, there are also, of course, issues of social pressure such as, and also related other responsibilities that women have to carry out almost as a given, like caregiving responsibilities. And then there are underreporting of a lot of gender-based violence that continues to be prevalent in India. And then there are questions of economic dependence too. Lancet, you quoted Lancet in one of your previous responses. In 2021, Lancet found that 40% of women in India reported experiencing gender-based violence, which is, of course, a major risk for mental health issues. My question is twofold. One, how can you address these gender barriers? Because the approach to dealing with mental health will have to be equitable. It cannot have gender biases and prejudices. And two, what role can organizations such as yours, the Live Love Laugh Foundation, play in creating targeted programs to address this gender related and also, kind of dismantle the gender prejudices that have crept in? Anisha?
So Gaurav, I think numbers, in a sense, and while you're absolutely right, I think numbers only tell half the story, right? And so I just want to sort of clarify one thing. I think in India, culturally, of course, we all know that mental illness is something that affects, any individual, any gender, from any socioeconomic background. So it really doesn't discriminate. When it comes to, some of the statistics, I think it's important to understand that in India, typically men culturally are not allowed to necessarily show their emotions. And so, I'm wondering how many men actually, how many cases of men going through mental illness are actually reported. And I think probably, a lot of the cases would probably, show up, or signs and symptoms may show up as alcoholism and substance abuse, and not necessarily mental illness. So I think that's just one thing that I want to sort of point out, because, for example, when a young boy, if you have, let's say, a young girl and a young boy in a house, and for some reason, if the young girl is crying, it's relatively okay. But if a young boy is crying, the typical thing to say is, boys don't cry. Why don't cry? So I think that sort of culturally seeps in to the system, and therefore men in general, but specifically in India, are not necessarily encouraged to be vulnerable, to show emotion, and things like that. So I think that's one thing. Apart from that, though, when it comes to women, I think absolutely. I think the again, culturally, we are probably, it's sort of an unsaid thing that women are primarily, caregivers for everyone around them, from a young age, starting off with, let's say, parents. You're either a sibling to a sister or a brother, and then once you get married, you have other sort of responsibilities, and then of course, parenthood, motherhood. So I think women in India, and this is something I try and talk about when I speak at various forums, which is, for some reason, women in India don't have as much of an ability to prioritize themselves when it comes to their health, not just mental health, sometimes even their physical health. We're so sort of taught to, or it's ingrained, that we have to put others first. And so, in that process of putting others first and being sort of selfless and caring for everyone else, we actually forget to care for ourselves. And so, I think it's very, very important or critical for women, but also the family systems around them, to ensure that they're able to take care of their own health, physical and mental. And in this case, of course, mental health in particular. So whether that means, prioritizing self-care, even if it's something as simple or basic as exercising a little bit every day, and whatever really works. So I think that's something that, at least I try and propagate. So that's one part of it. And then to answer your question on what can, Live, Love, Laugh do, and tying into my previous point, a large focus of the foundation, apart from persons with mental illness, and of course stemming from my own experience as a caregiver, is an equal and important focus on caregiving. And we all know, like I mentioned, that most caregivers in India are predominantly women, and we see a lot of that, especially in our rural mental health program. This is a community-based program that we run across 7 states, where most of the caregivers end up being, women, whether it's daughters or mothers, sisters. And, not only do they have to sort of care for their loved ones in cases of severe mental illness typically, but also, try and find ways to earn a living for, to be able to run and maintain the home. And so a lot of times, the caregivers of this program actually, end up experiencing mental illness themselves. And therefore, we have, psychosocial support or counseling support, as well as support group systems created specifically for caregivers who happen to be women in this program. So I think there's overall, coming back to, one of the earlier questions, I think overall, yes, there is absolutely, a lot to do for women. There's a lot to do for men. There's just a lot to do overall. But yeah, I think the numbers only sort of tell half the story.
Absolutely. And I like the point you made about, there's probably a little bit more underreporting among men than women, contrary to popular belief. And that reminds me of the 90s Hollywood blockbuster, Boys Don't Cry, which is kind of dealt with a similar theme. On your foundation, on the Love Foundation, specifically, what are some of the most effective strategies you have implemented to ensure that how greater awareness leads to tangible creation of tangible support systems for individuals and also communities, both in cities and villages? Anisha?
So there's, various things that we've done, Gaurav, from the beginning. One of the first things we started off by doing is, scoping out the sort of landscape of credible information and help that was available at the time in 2015 on mental health. And to be honest, there really wasn't too much. And so, we were one of the first. We wanted to be able to create not only, a repository of information, but also resources. And so we were one of the first back in 2015 to have a website that had credible information on mental health, particularly stress, anxiety, and depression. But once you create that awareness, you also have to then, enable access, like I said earlier. So we started off, by listing helpline numbers that were available in the country. And 10 years ago, we had only, one helpline, which was the TIS, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences helpline that was available. And now in 2025, we are able to list about 15 to 18 private as well as government-run helplines, and that just shows the amount of progress that we've made. So that is sort of one in a sense tangible way that people can reach out to for help and support. And we get, a lot of the people who visit our website are actually clicking on these numbers, and we get, some amount of confidential, of course, while maintaining confidentiality, we get some amount of reporting back into how many of those calls actually went into these helpline numbers. And for some of the helplines, almost 50% of the calls that go in to those helplines come from the LiveLoveLaugh website. Secondly, currently we have around 350 mental health professionals across various cities that people can reach out to for help and support. Now, between the helplines and these professionals, none of them are run or operated by LLL, but it's in line with our sort of mission of being able to enable that access. And so when we are sort of in touch with some of these professionals, we also hear and know that a lot of those clients come into the professionals again from our website. So that's just one piece on the website. Outside of that, of course, we have anecdotal stories from actual mental health professionals, either on our board or otherwise, who come into therapy saying and been inspired by, let's say, Deepika's journey or the work of the foundation. And so we wanted to sort of come out and seek help and support. And lastly, I think on the rural front, I was talking about our community-based mental health program. You have to understand that in rural areas, the way in which you would tackle awareness and stigma is very different. And I say this because in rural areas, there is a very high dependency or reliance on faith healers and religious practices. And so we have to tackle the stigma breakage at a community level. We organize street plays. We organize various aspects of wall writings and distribution of pamphlets to actually break down that stigma. And it takes a little bit of time. But once it does, these are individuals from the community as well as the caregivers of the beneficiaries themselves, who actually over a period of time in our program take ownership of the program. We form various caregiver groups who we call champions. So the champions are formed at the block level, at the federation level. And these sort of caregiver champions and the family federations that we create actually are trained in understanding what their rights are and how to advocate for their rights. And then the running of the entire program over a period of 5 to 7 years is actually done by these individuals living in the community. And for us, that's probably one of the greatest examples of how you can make that sort of change, not just from a behavior change perspective, but also transform not just the life of, say, one family, but transform the lives of multiple families in a village setting, or in in an entire district, where they themselves become sort of champions, as we call them, for the rest of the community. So these are just some ways in which Live, Love, Laugh is actually going about the awareness piece.
Absolutely. Anisha, let's change tack a bit. We now see corporates are increasingly recognizing the importance of mental health, which is a very good thing. But the impact of many of their initiatives and programs, if I may say so, continue to remain a little suboptimal. According to a 2022 Deloitte report, which is the latest one which we could actually research, it said that poor mental health costs Indian employers approximately, it's an eye-popping number, 14 billion US dollars annually. And this is primarily because mental health results in absenteeism and attrition, etc., etc. The question is this: how can companies? Because there's also the view that whatever companies are doing, large or small, in the space of mental health for their employees, actually borders on tokenism, and in many cases they're also described by many as lip service. So how can companies move beyond token gestures to create a culture of genuine mental health wellness for their employees? And as an addition to that, as a corollary, what steps can organizations take to mental health as part of the core values, to not just and take it beyond just holding just some L&D sessions on mental health?
So, Gaurav, I think it's a very, very important question. I think increasingly, and probably especially with the younger generation, millennials and probably Gen Zs, and if you have this age group working in your organization, extremely important to pay attention to some of the things that they're sort of asking for, advocating for. And I don't think, and sort of course, being one myself, I don't think anyone is saying, that we don't want to work hard. I think it's definitely not at the cost of anyone's health, physical or mental. And so I think for leaders and organizations to understand that employees today almost sort of, want to see organizations prioritizing mental health, operating from a space of empathy, and really just allowing some level of flexibility when it comes to situations, especially if someone is struggling. Because the statistics that you mentioned, apart from everything else, I think for organizations to understand, it really doesn't help their own productivity and profitability, right, in an organization. So I think coming to what organizations can do, I think firstly, everything stems from the culture that you set within an organization. And there are, a few examples of some organizations that focus on mental health and sort of prioritize it. A lot of that has to come from senior level management or the senior leadership within the organization, and that's really when the culture within an organization can actually change. So right now in India, there are different buckets of companies. There are those that genuinely want to do work in mental health, genuinely want to, be there for their employees and provide, whatever is possible from a mental health perspective. So I think companies, really need to prioritize this at a, leadership level, because as an employee, if I'm fearful that speaking to the counselor that's made available to me might, will I lose my job as a result of it? Will any of that information go to my reporting manager or to my boss? Or will, let's say, another employee, get a promotion instead of me if I'm going through mental illness? I think there's some of these fears that need to be alleviated, which can typically only be done by creating that culture of empathy, creating a culture where, it's okay to be vulnerable and share your narratives, creating a culture where you're feeling sort of supported and heard in case, you need that. So I think that's sort of, one bucket of companies that are prioritizing mental health, but they need to do, a little bit more on the stigma reduction front and creating the culture. And then the other sort of, bucket is like you mentioned, those who are sort of, doing it more as like an HR activity and sort of just being able to, tick tick certain boxes. And I think employees are smart today, and they really know, which are those companies that are actually doing it because they want to, or doing it just, for various other reasons. So for those companies, I think it's really important that they actually, take it seriously, because like I said, apart from everything else, there's also a benefit in terms of productivity and profitability, and therefore the loss of that when you don't have a healthy workforce. And lastly, there are companies that probably, for various reasons, including resources or just availability of bandwidth, are just not prioritizing mental health. And I think for all of the reasons I mentioned above, I think it's extremely critical for all of these companies, irrespective of what kind of journey they're on or what level they're at. Very, very important to prioritize this. And overall, just, apart from productivity and profitability, I think just overall from a humanistic perspective, if you have, let's say, an employee who's been diagnosed with cancer, you won't, put heavy deadlines on them, and you're not going to you will allow, a certain amount of leave and medical care that they can accept. So if it happens for other, let's say, health-related illnesses, why not mental health as well?
Finally, Anisha, the LiveLoveLaugh Foundation has completed a decade of very impactful work. But if you look back now, what has been the most surprising or the unexpected challenge in the journey so far? And how did you eventually overcome it? Because it would have come completely unplanned. And what are the lessons you've taken from it? And how did you eventually overcome that barrier? Anisha?
I think, this whole sort of mental health space or sector is extremely challenging to navigate for, of course, for individuals. We've outlined that, but also to be able to do work in this space. I think one of the things that we face on a regular basis is, one, how much are we prioritizing? And when I say we, I'm talking about Live, Love, Laugh, let's say the team. We have to be able to sort of, take care of ourselves. And often just because of the kind of work we do, and we see the scale of the work and how much there is to do, sometimes we forget to take care of ourselves. And it becomes so critical and important for us to be able to maintain our own routines and make sure we're prioritizing and taking care of ourselves in order to be able to do the work that we do and take care of, or help and support other people. So I think that's, I would say, a learning, not really a challenge, just a learning for us. Secondly, in this line of work, and especially with mental illness, there isn't any one sort of sector or geography or area that you can look at and say, these people or this sector doesn't need help and support. Having said that, we're only one organization. We're, of course, trying to do as much as we can, but sometimes there are sort of decisions that we have to take that become extremely difficult because it becomes a little bit of a heart versus mind sort of scenario. And so that is something that is challenging, extremely challenging still today. Not sure if we've been able to, while we've done certain things very well, I wouldn't say we've cracked that, and that's probably something that's always going to remain a challenge. And especially with nonprofit work, you want to be able to help every single individual out there. But sometimes you have to realize that you're only one organization, and being sort of focused on what you want to achieve as an organization and playing to your strengths as well becomes extremely important. So I would say that's a sort of a second sort of a challenge. And outside of that, I think the third thing is just the fact that there will always be naysayers towards mental health, towards the work that we are doing. Even today, you have people who maybe don't understand mental health or don't want to understand mental health and still feel like this is use terminologies very loosely and things like that. But for me, I think I look at it from the perspective of, it just shows that there is so much more of awareness and destigmatization work that needs to happen. And for us as an organization, is that much more critical that we sort of double down on the work that we're doing. And even though we're completing 10 years, a decade of substantial work this year, my mind at least is already sort of starting to work on what about the next decade. How do we scale up our work? And like I was saying in my first question, which is the scale at the sort of the magnitude of this problem in India is so vast that I think we've only sort of scratched the surface. We really need to be able to dig deep and hopefully in the next decade and 10 years from now, when we look back, we can say, yes, we've actually made a huge dent when it comes to the work in mental health.
Absolutely, Anisha. Thank you so much for sharing your deep insights and perspective on a variety of issues on the immediate and long-term priorities for mental health in India and how different sectors, the government, the corporates, the NGOs, the communities and foundations such as yours can collaborate to achieve these goals, because mental health is increasingly being recognized as a critical component for growth, for sustainable development, and for everything else. It is something that we need to mainstream, and you have rightly articulated with deep insights. Thanks so much for taking the time out and dropping by to have this conversation with us.
Thank you, Gaurav. Like I said earlier, it's a pleasure speaking and very insightful questions. I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you so much for having me, and more importantly for giving us the platform to talk about this mental health as a topic, as well as the work that LiveLoveLaugh Foundation does.